The Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, the granddaddy of civil rights era Jewish justice organizations, was founded in 1964 in Chicago by Rabbi Robert Marks, Midwest director of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Less than half an hour after Marks received the initial $15,000 check that launched JCUA, he received a fortuitous phone call. A young graduate student at the University of Wisconsin named Luke Kreinberg was looking for a job. So Marks hired Kreinberg, whose first assignment in 1965 was to work with the Northwest Community Organization, supporting their efforts to fight slumlords and provide low-cost mortgages. That same year, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago to launch the Chicago Freedom Movement. The campaign, which would prove to be among King's final efforts, was intended to address systemic urban challenges like rampant poverty, racial injustice, and housing discrimination. The nascent JCUA immediately joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its allies in supporting Dr. King's work, a campaign that saw, according to King himself, hostility greater even than that of mobs in Alabama and Mississippi. JCUA, like Jews United for Justice Today and other similar Jewish organizations to follow, saw its role as bearing witness to injustice and utilizing Jewish texts and values as animating forces for addressing inequity. This is to say, they were in the business of telling stories, of giving voice to the voiceless, and better using allyship to create a platform for the unheard to finally be heard. The man who in 64-65 inspired JCUA to tell the stories of Black and brown Americans died 50 years ago this past week. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot in the neck at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis and was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. This week of Pesach, as we approach our Yizkor service, we mark the 50th yahrzeit of a man who shaped American discourse and thinking about race like no one else. As each of us who mourns loved ones, our parents, our siblings, our partners, some of us our children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, more, as each of us prepares to offer prayers in their memory. We mourn too for this friend of rabbis and inspiration to the Jewish community. Here in this city, in this bitterly divided nation still plagued by the insidious imprint of chattel slavery, we grieve this week for the snuffing out, far too young, of one of America's brightest lights and one of the most important prophetic voices this nation has ever heard. Moses was 120 years old when he stood on Har Nevo and gazed across the Jordan into the promised land he would never reach. Dr. King was 39 when he was gunned down. He was just about 3 years younger than I am today. The rage and rioting unleashed by King's murder resulted in human casualties, property damage, in more than 100 American cities, including Baltimore, of course. 43 people were killed, approximately 3,500 were injured, 27,000 were arrested, and 58,000 National Guardsmen and Army troops were deployed to impose order, and not along the Mexican border. Yizkor is about telling stories. It's about reminding ourselves of lives lived and work incomplete. We often cite Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, it's not upon you to complete the work. V'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena, but neither are you free to desist from it. Of course, Rabbi Tarfon, when he said this, his intention wasn't for the work to remain incomplete, but rather for a great handoff to occur. Our friends, our colleagues, they pick up where we left off, as do our children and their children after them. Moshe himself was keenly aware of that which he and the Jewish people had not yet achieved. He was not ready to die. The Midrash in Devarim Rabbah imagines Moses arguing with God, pleading with the Kadosh Baruch Hu to reconsider, going through quite literally each of Kubler-Ross's stages of grief as he slowly comes to accept his fate. Moses made light of the decree, says the Midrash. Israel has so many times committed great sins, and whenever I prayed for them, God immediately answered my prayer. And later, Moses pleads, Ribono Shel Olam, the labor and pains I have devoted to making Israel believe in your name, the trouble I've gone to in connection with the mitzvot in order to fix Torah for them, I thought just as I witnessed the woe, so too will I behold their wheel. But now that the wheel of Israel has come, you say to me, Lo ta'avor et Yarden hazeh. You shall not go over this Jordan. I don't know about your people, the people that each of you is remembering today, but I know my dad thought about how much he was going to miss, how much he wished he could meet his grandchildren or enjoy his retirement. Some of those who leave this world do so with a truly clear conscience, but all of us leave tasks undone, experiences unhad, beauty undiscovered, and justice not yet achieved. Think about your own loved ones. What worthy work did they leave incomplete? What will you do to complete it, or at least move it forward? We know Dr. King thought about his legacy because 50 years ago, this past week, the night before he died, he spoke these words, which were as prescient then as they have become legendary since. Well, I don't know what will happen now, he said. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Now, King didn't come by his awareness of his own mortality by accident. In that very same speech of April 3rd, his final speech, he told the following story. You know, several years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said yes. And the next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to the Harlem hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon, and that blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you drown in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had sneezed, I would have died. Dr. King went on to describe a letter he received after the incident. It came from a young girl. He said, and I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at White Plains High School. She said, while it should not matter, I'd like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. King went on to explain how happy he also was that he didn't sneeze. For if he had died a decade earlier, he wouldn't have been around for the sit-ins, for the March on Washington, Birmingham, Selma, nor the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That night, 50 years ago, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King offered a eulogy of sorts, a reflection on his life's work by a young man who, thank God, managed to live several lifetimes' worth of experiences in less than 40 years. It was a speech as much about memories as it was about policies. Yizkor is about memory. But as a rule, we don't say Yizkor for ourselves. If Yizkor is about telling others stories, it is also about doing our best to make them our own. And that's exactly what Dr. King did that night in April 1968. He told our story, the Jewish story, penned in the Sefer Torah of the greatest prophet in his last moments before, according to that same midrash, God took his soul with a nishikat meta, a tender and terminal kiss. Professor Susanna Heschel, in an article about her father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and his friendship with King, writes the following: believing that King's use of the Exodus would be strengthened if he were to participate in a Passover celebration, Heschel invited King and his wife to his family Seder to take place on April 16th, 1968. Heschel's note to King read as follows: the ritual and the celebration of that evening seek to make present to us the spirit and the wonder of the Exodus from Egypt. It is my feeling that your participation at a Seder celebration would be of very great significance. King, of course, didn't make it to Seder that year or any other. But that night before he died, on April 3rd, he told a Passover story of slavery and redemption on the road not yet traveled. He told the story of a people and a world unredeemed. I may not finish the work, he implied, but one day this holy task of ending systemic racism will be complete and we will have reached the promised land. 7 days after King was assassinated, on April 11th, 5 days before he was to attend the Seder at the Heschel's home, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. The grueling work of confronting northern racism and shouting down housing discrimination in Chicago took a great leap forward that day. And yet here we are, 50 years later, having come so far and yet having still so very far to go. Dr. King, among so many other things, was the victim of gun violence in America. This week there was yet another mass shooting, another mass casualty event brought on by the toxic combination of hate and permissive gun laws. My cousin Oliver, who's been to Beth Am, works at YouTube. He was in the building that day. I called him a few hours later. We spoke. He's unharmed, thank God, but shaken as you can imagine. This 8th day of Pesach is supposed to be redemptive. You heard the Haftarah, its beauty. Ushafta mayim b'sasom mi'maynei ha'Yeshua. It's supposed to be about redemption, fulfilling Isaiah's beautiful messianic vision. But sometimes redemption feels asymptotic, does it not? As if it's always arriving, but never materializing. Which brings me back to Yizkor. There's a beautiful component to the Yizkor prayer in which we commit a ten tzedakah ba'ado, to giving tzedakah in the memory of our loved ones. For Jews, memory is a verb. Our thoughts demand righteous action, a step toward bettering the world our loved ones left behind. This Pesach, as we turn our attention to the memory of our honored dead, we pray for a world redeemed. We pray for a country healed of its deep wounds. We pray for peace not of avoidance or complacency, but of achievement and of justice. And we commit, hopefully, in the memory of Dr. King and all those who began or furthered some holy work, to never give up. We may not finish, surely we won't, but we are not free to desist. Not free to desist. V'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. Rabbi Tarfon's words remind us that freedom is not a blank check. Freedom is given to or earned by the free as a down payment toward a more just society. Or as Emma Lazarus put it, until we are all free, we are none of us free. We rise for Yizkor.